going back to the beginning. So the system that we've got worked out now in Brighton, which we're quite proud of, started with the Pathway team coming in 2012, and now we're going to talk about how to go about starting our Pathway team and the Pathway Social Franchising Project. Paul, do you want to come sit up here? So, which is going to be me again. I'm still Chris Sargent, and Paul Hamlin, who is the manager of the project at Pathway. We were hoping to have Maggie Kirk here, who is the GP who's been working very hard over the last few years to get a Pathway team going down in Bournemouth, but whoever was going to give her overnight accommodation said they wouldn't, because she's been here with all of us and they might give her, she might give them coronavirus, so unfortunately she can't join us. So we've, as Alex mentioned earlier in the opening address, the spread so far for Pathway has been quite slow. We're on to about 12 with the one that's just about to start now in the last 10 years. So the ways we thought of that you can get Pathway teams going is either to find somebody with loads of money high up in government who says you have to have a Pathway team in every hospital, which is what we would love, and then we could go ahead and do them. So far that hasn't happened. So we're on option 2, which is trying to start teams in individual places and sort of starting the fires around the place and progressing that way. What's happened over the last couple of years is that we've been working with the Health Foundation, who've given us some money to explore social franchising, which is the concept of putting together everything that you know, that you've learnt over the last few years, making that into materials that anybody can use, and then make it easier to start a Pathway team in a new place. So, the most important thing probably in starting a new Pathway team is to find a local champion. And by that we mean someone who takes it upon themselves to drive the process forward. So each area that's had a Pathway team start usually has a person who's interested. It may be a GP, may be a nurse, it may be a manager in a service who think this is a good idea for them to get started with a Pathway team. That probably is the most important thing, to have somebody who really wants to make it happen. Somebody who understands what Pathway is about, which is having people usually coming in from the community into a hospital to find and support and help plan the discharge of homeless people. And I think a lot of places think they have people who do that already, but when a Pathway team starts there, they realise that they weren't quite doing the same thing. The role of a local champion is to build up local interest, so get the stakeholders together, get everybody who's interested, plan a needs assessment, so find out what the actual need is in that hospital, write a business case, so a form of words which is going to persuade the people who have the funds to put their money towards this, and then help to plan and launch a team. So the first stage of that is building up the local interest, so getting the local stakeholders together. So usually that starts with some sort of event, so having a meeting, drawing people in, talking about what's happened in other areas. Is this something we'd like to happen in our area? We will support that, so Pathway spend a lot of time going around to different places, going to stakeholder events, explaining the advantages of a Pathway team, and trying to drum up that interest in getting at least a needs assessment started to examine what the issue might be. Also, that process starts the idea of somebody is obviously going to have to fund this, it's going to have to come from somewhere, lots of people can be involved, but ultimately somebody is going to come out of somebody's funds. So who is that going to be? Who are the people going to start putting their hands up to do that? So the needs assessment is the bit of work that looks at how many people who are homeless are coming into your hospital, how many people are coming into A&E, how often is it that somebody who perhaps, if there was a team around, there would be a better result, the person wouldn't have to be in hospital for longer than they need to be. all hospitals seem to think that homeless people love being in hospital. That is not my experience. Usually people who've been homeless are desperate to get out of hospital. They hate it. It's not the environment they're used to. They'd rather be anywhere rather than hospital. But there's this idea in hospitals that homeless people are desperately trying to stay in. So what are your rates of admission? How many people have you got? How much is it costing you? And how much could a pathway team help you? Also, it's worth looking at what happens at the moment. So what happens around discharge planning for homeless people. Often that is, we tell them that there's a housing office somewhere in the town and we tell them to go there the day that they're discharged from hospital. That sort of discharge plan is not very likely to work, as I'm sure everybody in this room knows. We have sort of calculated that if you're having more than 200 people who are homeless attending the hospital each year, you're probably in the area of needing to have a pathway team in order to make sure that when people are being treated and discharged from hospital, that they go to somewhere where they can continue to recover, continue to get better, and won't be having to come back to hospital as often. So making the business case, obviously we take all that data together. Then we look at the financial cost in terms of how much does each extra day of being in hospital cost you, how much does each extra A&E attendance cost you. We make a proposal for a team, so depending on what those figures show us, we'll say how many people we think should be in your team and how the team should be made up. What that team is likely to cost you, the expected benefits from having a team in your hospital, and then all the sort of building evidence. Again, as Alex was talking about earlier, we've got quite a strong evidence base now for better outcomes from people who are seen in hospitals that have pathway teams who are involved in looking after them and planning their discharge and then handing them on to community services when they go. So a bit like we were saying in the previous presentation, if everything is linked together better, you're much likely to be able to hold that person out in the community. But if a hospital just keeps discharging somebody who's come in homeless out to being homeless, that is just going to be a repeated pattern. Obviously we make we sort of make the business case, but we also make the humanitarian case as well. It's not just about saving money. It's also about making sure that people have a fair use of the health service and get the best out of it that they can, and that sticks, that they continue to benefit from that after they've been discharged from hospital. It seems pointless to do lots of expensive medical care and tests and scans and treatments on people when they're in hospital and then send them out, so that all goes back to how it was before, and then 2 months later you're doing the whole thing again. So is this the bit where you take over? No? Next slide. Okay, so the team design and service specification. So the core of a pathway team, again, as most of you probably know, is to have some GP input, so that's usually part-time GP input, a full-time nurse. We recommend band 7 nurse, although that doesn't always happen. And then a full-time equivalent housing worker, advocate or care navigator to do the role that we were talking about that Katie does, which is the getting to know the person in hospital, then taking them out of the hospital and making sure they settle into their situation when they're out. And then we've done a calculation in terms of how many attendances you have per year as to how many people you should have in your team, because obviously the more people you've got, the bigger the team should be. I'm going to hand over.
Thanks. That's you as well, actually. But that's fine. Okay.
I've gone wrong.
Oh, that's you as well, but that's fine. Okay. Thanks, Chris. So there are potentially 4 different organisations involved in the startup of a pathway team. So obviously we need a funder. This is usually going to be the CCG, and their role is to monitor the team's progress and also support the hospital and the provider organisation. The hospital obviously hosts the team. They need to provide space and also somewhere in their management structure for the team to sit, so they're accountable. And then we've got the provider organisation, and they're the organisation that employs and manages the team and actually delivers the service. And Pathway's role as the franchisor is to support and provide guidance to all of the above organisations. This next slide, it's quite complicated. Basically shows some of the thinking we've done with our social franchising consultant, Spring Impact, about the different relationships that we need in place to start a team. However, in reality, we anticipate there could be other potential configurations. So one of our new sites, the hospital, is going to be the funder and the host, and then the provider is going to be a specialist homelessness community-based primary care organisation. And in an ideal world, they're our best, they're our ideal provider. But there's another site which we're working with where it looks like the hospital are going to be both the host, the funder, and also the provider. So we're having to adapt our approach to local requirements.
Yeah, I think we think that the best model is in reach from a specialist community primary care provider for people who are homeless, so like Arch. But obviously, if a hospital wants to employ someone to be in the team, then that's good too. That's much better than not having a team at all. So if we have in reach from the community, so from the nursing side and from the support organisation and from the general practice side, that's probably best. But there are other combinations which can work equally as well.
Yeah. Okay, so once we've got an agreement with a funder signed, we move on to the service startup phase. And this requires the provider to appoint a project manager fairly early. So we've learned through experience that it's going to take at least 3 months to get everything sorted out. So the project manager will be responsible for both recruiting the Pathway team and ensuring practical things are in place. So the team are going to need office space, honorary contracts and access to IT systems, and also, as mentioned, they're going to need an accountable hospital manager to oversee the team. Pathway support in this area includes recruitment guidance. We've got job descriptions for all the core team roles, and we're also available to sit on the recruitment panels for staff members. We've produced a detailed startup guide for the project manager so that they know what they need to do. And then once the team's in place, we provide 2 days of initial team training and a structured staff induction program, which includes shadowing existing Pathway teams and obviously visiting community services that the team are going to be working in partnership with in the community. So moving on to the kind of ongoing support package. This can probably be summarised under 3 headings. So we've got direct support, some written resources, and the benefits of being part of the Pathway network. So I'll talk a bit about each. So direct support comes from a core team at Pathway, so we're available for ad hoc support. They can email or phone us for help, for issues. We also have structured calls every month with the team for troubleshooting. And then in the first 2 years, we visit the team for a half day just to review how things are going. And then after the first 2 years of operation, this will turn into peer evaluation. So we're going to get the Pathway teams to visit each other and appraise each other's progress. The written resources are provided through quite a large online operations manual that we've been producing. This includes guidance on all areas of service delivery, template documents, and probably most importantly, a service quality framework so that we can support teams to deliver the model and track their progress against each other. In terms of the benefits of being part of the Pathway network, some of this just comes from the regional network events that we're going to be supporting, and then every year we're going to have a Pathway Teams Day, so get all the teams together to learn from each other. Also be providing kind of regular communications, so training and policy updates that are relevant to the work of the teams. And I think the long-term aim is really just that when we've got a network of teams working together, they'll be sharing best practice, helping us to improve the support package that we provide, and also helping us to specify what is the core Pathway model and making sure that we're all doing the best we can. So, last slide. In terms of future progress, we signed up our first social franchise team in October, and that was Hull. Very pleased with their progress. And then we've got Bournemouth. Hopefully, they're going to be operational from May this year. We're really hoping they've got 2 or 3 others that are really close to signing up, and they should come online sometime this year. So as Chris described, there's a tremendous amount of work that goes into preparing a local site. So we've got about 22 further potential sites that we're trying to support towards progressing to a Pathway team. 11 of these have already done needs assessments or have them in progress. And then finally, through this model, we're hoping that we can become financially sustainable, but this probably won't happen for at least 3 to probably 5 years. So we're probably going to need further funding until then, and we're very keen to sign up new teams. So if you think your hospital might need a pathway team, please do speak to us. Okay, I think it's time for questions.
So, any questions about that bit? Yes, the lady in the middle.
Hopefully you can hear me. Thank you. Thank you. Just a question. To what extent do you relate to other organisations? So you've got very much, to some extent, a clinical focus, with the providers.
Yeah.
And so I'm just thinking about housing associations and sort of the housing teams in the council.
Yeah, well, certainly from the Brighton team, so that's sort of talking a little bit about what we were talking about before, that develops over time. So I think perhaps when we first started out, there was a little bit of suspicion from the council housing team about what we were going to do. Were we going to really increase their workload? Were we going to be bringing lots of people down at inappropriate times when they were just about to close and all that type of stuff? But I think what they found is that since the team's been going, a lot of that stuff has stopped happening because we've built up really good working relationships with them. And I think because the team try to refer early rather than when the person is medically fit for discharge, then it's to their advantage as well. It makes the system work better for everybody. Obviously, you can't change the whole system, but I think you can make it as efficient as it can be. And I think we help with that by bringing sort of medical evidence in, but also understanding how those outside services work as well. So we have quite good relationships with local accommodation providers, the street outreach teams, housing, the community drug services. I think all that develops once the team's up and running.
Hello, just coming back to the housing authority subject the lady was just touching on. You mentioned earlier on that you do the duty to refer really early, which is amazing. With that in mind, is it necessary for the patient to be taken down to the housing authority each time? Do you not have maybe a patient-centred where the housing authority would come to the hospital and do the housing interviews?
Yeah, I think it works differently in different places, and it's probably more Katie's area than mine. We've tried it in various different ways, and the way that it works best is for the person to be picked up, taken and supported through the process, because a lot can happen for someone who's been coming to hospital when they're homeless, been in hospital for a few weeks, suddenly they're out again, and the housing department is 2 or 3 miles away, as it is where we are. If they're going there under their own steam, a lot can go wrong in the intervening time. So the process that we found works the best is to have the person taken. If you could get the housing service to come into the hospital and do the assessment in the hospital, that would be great too. And certainly Brighton, we've had that sometimes, but not always.
Worth mentioning Hull.
Yeah.
So I gathered that in Hull, our first franchise team, they do a lot of the housing liaison work over the phone, sending documents, and actually temporary accommodation is normally agreed before the patient even leaves hospital. So that's a really good example of partnership working.
I'm about to join the Bournemouth Pathway team.
Brilliant.
So that we're just kind of looking at how to do that in the most efficient way.
It depends on your housing department and how cooperative they are, I guess, as well.
I think the more you can break down those barriers by getting people coming in or going out, I think probably what's happened in our area is that when we've temporarily had a housing worker coming in, it's never lasted for very long. They've always been pulled back out again. So that may well be a good model if you can get that to happen.
I suppose just moving up, because we're at the start of ours, I suppose I'm more concerned with an overarching sort of more strategic view of it, that those partners aren't brought on board at the start. So you're almost staffing a team that just to have those arguments with adult social care at the point somebody is about to be discharged, rather than agreeing those processes in the background. I suppose that's also dependent on the local authority.
Yeah, It depends. Yeah, definitely if you can set it up like that to start with, that would be ideal. I think ours has probably grown into the model that we've got that works for our locality. But it's, as Paul says, it's different in different places. The back's got the mic.
Hi, thank you. I'd be interested to know whether or not you've had any crossovers with a housing first model, and whether you're aware of. Are you aware of what housing?
Yeah,
first
yeah, I know what housing first is.
Okay, and whether sort of Pathway can sit alongside that mechanism or that system operating within a regional area.
I don't see why not. Again, that will be different in different areas. In our area, that's not particularly well developed, and they wouldn't take people directly from hospital. But in an area where they would, that would be one of the options for the Pathway team to alert Housing First that there was a person in the hospital who was suitable, and then it could work from there. So I guess we have to be flexible in the Pathway teams as to what the local system is for housing. Yeah, there's no reason why it couldn't dovetail into that quite well. Lady here.
Hi, just out of interest, how much influence do you have over statutory social services decisions, and do you have any kind of joint partnership around maybe completing combined care act assessments, or can you fast track them?
So we have some influence, but we don't have any sort of statutory influence. So it's really a case of building relationships and talking to people on an individual basis. So sometimes we find ourselves well aligned with what adult social care are wanting to do, and sometimes not quite so much. But again, I think over time that builds up. Sometimes we disagree completely, and then we have to find a way through, but not that often. So those times are quite unusual, and I think if you are able to have somebody advocating for the person in the hospital to adult social care and asking for care act assessments and things, then they tend to get a better outcome from that. So I think it's always better if there's a Pathway team involved, although sometimes we would like things to come out differently than how they actually do.
Okay, thank you.
Make this the last question, and people can get off for their lunch. Lady there.
Thanks. Just with what the last lady was saying about the social care.
All right, sorry.
The Pathway team I work in, we didn't have a social worker, and it was building up those relationships over time. For the last 18 months, we've had a social worker seconded into our team. The difference is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, the results she's had with not only care act assessments for people with package of care, but for human rights assessments, the outcomes have been amazing. And we work for one trust, funded by a CCG to work in another trust, and it's the other trust that we work in who's seconded, who's paying for most of her salary, with a bit added from social services because she's a Band 7 senior practitioner. It's just wonderful. It's worth all the effort of getting there.
Right, okay, thank you. Okay, I think we will leave it there and let people get off to their lunch. Thank you for listening to us.